He wasn't just a teacher. He was a mentor, a role model, the kind of man people trusted without question. But trust can be deadly. For years, he stood in front of a classroom teaching lessons on history, guiding young minds. But when the final bell rang and the hallways emptied, he became something else. Something unimaginable. No one saw it coming. No one suspected a thing. But the truth was always there, hidden in the details no one thought to question. How do you spot a killer? Would you recognize the darkness lurking behind a familiar face? Join me as we uncover the dark secret of John Smith, and the truth that still lingers in the halls he once walked. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, because in the world of crime, the next twist is always around the corner. Now let's dive into today's case. John Smith was a man who existed in plain sight yet left almost no trace. He was the kind of teacher every school wanted, dedicated, disciplined, and endlessly patient. At Roosevelt High School in Austin, Texas, he was more than just another educator. He was respected, admired, even quietly revered. He never missed a day of work, never arrived late, and never appeared unprepared. His lessons were structured with meticulous care, his classroom a model of order and efficiency. Every book had its place, every paper was graded with the same neat, precise handwriting, and every student knew that in his class, there was no room for chaos. His presence was steady, his voice calm, and his manner reassuring. Parents spoke highly of him, praising his ability to explain complex subjects in a way that made sense, his ability to make even struggling students feel capable. His colleagues, too, found little to criticize. He was polite, professional, and never involved himself in gossip or petty disputes. He kept to himself, but in a way that seemed more like quiet humility than secrecy. And yet, for all the admiration, for all the respect, there were things about John Smith that did not quite fit. Students who sat in his classroom day after day began to notice small things, little details that felt off but were difficult to explain. The way he would stand at the front of the room, hands folded neatly in front of him, his posture rigid and unmoving, his gaze scanning the room, watching, always watching. The way he never seemed to blink enough, how his eyes, cold and unshaken, would fixate just a second too long after asking a question. Some joked that he was like a machine, programmed to teach, incapable of error, immune to the usual frustrations and stress that other teachers openly displayed. But there was something else, something beneath the surface, something unspoken but deeply unsettling. He never spoke about his life outside of school. He never shared personal stories, never mentioned a family, never let slip even the smallest detail about his past. When students asked if he had kids, he would simply smile and redirect the conversation. When they asked if he was married, he would change the subject entirely. Over time they stopped asking. And yet they couldn't help but wonder. The school staff knew little more than the students did. John Smith was friendly enough, but he kept his distance. He never attended faculty gatherings, never joined in on casual conversations in the break room. He never lingered in the halls to chat after class. He was polite, always willing to help if asked, but beyond that he remained an enigma. If another teacher mentioned their weekend plans, he would nod and listen, but he never shared his own. If asked directly what he did in his free time, he would give a vague answer, "Oh, just the usual," before turning the question back on the person who asked. It was subtle, easy to overlook, but in hindsight, it was the first sign that something about John Smith was not quite right. Outside of school, his life was just as much of a mystery. He lived alone in a house on the outskirts of town, a house that was as quiet and unremarkable as the man himself. No decorations, no seasonal wreaths on the door, no signs of a life being lived inside. No one in the neighborhood had ever been invited in. In fact, no one could recall ever seeing anyone knock on his door. No family visited for the holidays. No friends stopped by for a drink or a meal. The house was just there, a shell of a home with no warmth, no movement, and no sound. Neighbors would occasionally catch glimpses of him, leaving in the morning, dressed immaculately as always, or returning late in the evening, walking up his driveway with the same slow, deliberate steps. But that was it. That was all anyone ever saw. The curtains were always drawn. The windows never revealed what lay beyond. And at night, when the rest of the neighborhood was dark and still, a single light would remain on in John Smith's home, casting long, thin shadows through the cracks in the blinds. No one knew what he did in his free time. No one had ever heard him mention a hobby or a favorite pastime. He didn't frequent local restaurants. He didn't go to bars. He didn't attend community events. As far as anyone could tell outside of his job, he simply existed. A man of routine, of discipline, of control. But those who paid attention, those who thought back on their interactions with him, realized something chilling. John Smith wasn't just private. He wasn't just a reserved man who preferred solitude. There was something else. Something deliberate. Something calculated. It was as if he had designed his life in a way that left no gaps, no loose ends, and no room for anyone to look too closely. And no one ever did. For years, he had walked among them, unnoticed, unchallenged, his double life perfectly concealed beneath the mask of an ordinary man. A man who had spent years mastering the art of blending in. A man who was so precise, so careful, that no one had ever questioned him. But beneath the well-pressed shirts, the polite smiles, the unwavering patience, there was something else. Something waiting. Something hidden in plain sight. And when night fell, when the classroom doors locked and the last student had gone home, the man they thought they knew became something else entirely. The first body appeared in 2015. Her name was Rita Dominic. She was 18, bright, ambitious, and just weeks away from starting college. Her family described her as kind-hearted, the type of person who would drop everything to help a friend. On the night she disappeared, she had been walking home from a friend's house, a route she had taken dozens of times before. It wasn't far. A 10-minute walk at most. But she never made it. At first, her parents weren't worried. Maybe she had stopped somewhere along the way. Maybe she had stayed over at her friend's house. Maybe her phone had died and she couldn't call. But as the hours stretched into the next morning, their unease grew into terror. A missing persons report was filed. Flyers were printed. Friends and family scoured the streets. Hope clung in the air, until 3 days later, when her body was discovered in an abandoned lot on the outskirts of town. Lifeless. Discarded. No signs of struggle. No fingerprints. No DNA. No witnesses. It was as if she had been erased from existence, only to reappear as a corpse. The town was shaken. Parents warned their daughters not to walk alone. Streets that once felt safe now held an unspoken menace. But with no evidence, no leads, the case grew cold. And then, a few months later, it happened again. Jasmine Lee was 21, a college junior with dreams of becoming a journalist. She had been walking to her car after an evening class, her backpack slung over her shoulder, her phone in hand as she texted a friend. Campus security cameras captured her leaving the library at 8:37 p.m. She never made it home. At first, her disappearance seemed like a tragic anomaly, until weeks later her body was found in a drainage ditch 10 miles away. No forced entry into her car. No signs of a struggle. No clues left behind. Just another girl gone, another family shattered, another town left reeling. Then came Maria Gonzalez, 19, a waitress at a local diner. She had just finished her late shift, smiling as she waved goodbye to her coworkers. She got into her car, started the engine and drove off. But she never arrived home. Her car was found the next morning, parked neatly by the curb, the driver's side door locked. Her purse was still inside, untouched. But Maria was gone. A week later, her body was discovered in a wooded area outside of town. No footprints. No fibers. No sign of who had taken her. The pattern was impossible to ignore. The victims had no apparent connection. Different backgrounds. Different social circles. Some were students. Some were workers. Some were just passing through town. Yet, when their bodies surfaced, it was always the same. No forced entry. No defensive wounds. No DNA. No witnesses. Just another young woman vanished into the night, only to reappear lifeless days or weeks later. The disappearances were clean, precise, and almost surgical in execution. Whoever was responsible knew exactly what they were doing. And they were careful. Methodical. Invisible. Investigators pored over the evidence, desperate for a lead. They mapped out the disappearances, hoping for a pattern. And then, buried beneath the randomness, they found it. Every single victim, at some point in their lives, had lived within a 5-mile radius of Roosevelt High School. At first, it seemed like a coincidence. Thousands of people lived in that area. But for detectives, it was the first real thread, a connection so subtle, it had gone unnoticed. They began digging, looking into the school, its faculty, its staff. Who worked there? Who lived nearby? Who might have seen these women? Who might have known them even in passing? But the search led to nothing. No janitor with a criminal record. No suspicious teachers. No students with violent pasts. Just an ordinary school in an ordinary town. The connection was real but meaningless. The case remained frozen. The town held its breath, hoping the killings would stop. And all the while, John Smith continued his daily routine, undisturbed by the storm that was forming around him. Every morning he walked into his classroom, greeted his students with a steady smile, and carried on as if nothing had changed. He assigned homework. He graded papers. He stood at the front of the class, explaining equations in that calm and measured voice. And then at the end of the day he packed his bag, walked out of the school and disappeared into the night. And when darkness fell, somewhere in the city, another girl would vanish. Haley Richardson, 23, a veterinary assistant, disappeared while jogging in a park at dusk. Her earbuds were found lying in the grass. Her body surfaced a month later, miles away, with no trace of who had taken her. Emily Carter, 20, vanished on her way home from a friend's birthday party. Her car was still in the driveway, her keys in the ignition, her apartment door unlocked. She was never seen alive again. Victoria Nguyen, 17, a high school senior, left a movie theater with friends, got into her mother's car and drove home. She pulled into her driveway, her porch light flicked on. But she never stepped inside. Hours later, her mother found the car door open, her purse on the front seat. Victoria was gone. Her body was discovered 3 weeks later in a shallow grave near the highway. The truth was both chilling and invisible. John Smith was patient. He understood patterns, routines, and, most of all, how to avoid detection. He never acted impulsively. He never took anyone who might create a direct link back to him. No students. No colleagues. No one who knew him personally. He was careful, choosing victims carefully, ensuring each case appeared as random as possible. A girl walking home from work. A college student heading to her car. A visitor unfamiliar with the streets. He watched. He waited. And when the moment was right, he struck. No evidence. No mistakes. No trace. To the outside world, the murders seemed like the work of a ghost, untraceable, uncatchable. But in reality, the killer was a man standing in front of a classroom every single day, teaching their children, answering their questions, offering them guidance. The town lived in fear, parents locking their doors, scanning the news, wondering if the nightmare would ever end. But none of them knew that the man they feared was someone they trusted. Someone they saw every day. And no one suspected a thing. During school hours, John Smith was the picture of professionalism. He stood at the front of his classroom, gesturing toward the whiteboard, explaining historical events with a calm, measured voice. His students admired his knowledge, often staying after class to ask for extra help. He graded their papers with precision, offering constructive feedback. In the teacher's lounge, he made casual conversation, laughing at jokes, blending seamlessly into the faculty. He was the teacher parents trusted, the one they requested for their children, believing he truly cared about their education. But when the final bell rang and the students streamed out into the hallways, John Smith left the school with the same controlled demeanor, the same steady stride, and the same polite nods to fellow teachers. And then, just as he always did, he disappeared into his own world, the one no one ever saw. At first glance, his apartment was unremarkable. A small, sparsely furnished space on the edge of town, neatly kept, nothing out of place. The kitchen counters were clean, the bookshelves organized, the bed made with military precision. A framed diploma hung on the wall, alongside a few old photographs. His childhood home, a faded picture of him as a boy standing beside his parents. But beneath the surface the cracks began to show. His apartment was too neat, too controlled, and too empty. No personal touches. No family photos. No signs of visitors. A place designed for function, not comfort. A place where he could vanish when the school day ended. And then there was the office. A room with heavy curtains drawn at all times, the walls lined with bookshelves, not with textbooks, not with literature, but with volumes dedicated to forensics, criminal psychology, and unsolved murder cases. Thick binders sat on the desk, each labeled with a year, each containing pages of carefully compiled information. The contents were chilling. Newspaper clippings of missing persons, handwritten notes on the movements of potential targets, maps marked with red ink. He studied his victims as if they were research subjects, tracking their habits, memorizing their schedules, knowing when they would be alone. He didn't just stalk them, he understood them better than they understood themselves. He was meticulous. Every detail mattered. He noted what time they left for work, how often they changed their routines, who they spoke to the most. He recorded their habits, their favorite places, the paths they took when they thought no one was watching. He didn't rush. He didn't act on impulse. Everything was planned down to the smallest variable. And when he finally made his move, it was flawless. No DNA. No signs of struggle. No pattern that could link him to the crime. The disappearances seemed random to everyone else, but to John Smith, they were perfectly orchestrated. His fascination with crime wasn't just academic, it was personal. He spent hours consuming documentaries on serial killers, dissecting their mistakes, learning what not to do. He read true crime books cover to cover, highlighting passages, making notes in the margins. He watched interrogations, studying how suspects slipped up, how detectives broke them down. He practiced his own reactions in the mirror, ensuring that if he were ever questioned, his expression would remain neutral and his voice steady. He treated murder like an art form, one that required patience, discipline, and above all, control. But what made John Smith truly dangerous wasn't just his intelligence. It was the thrill he took in the hunt. He wasn't just killing, he was playing a game. A deadly contest between himself and the police, one where he was always 5 steps ahead. With each crime he refined his techniques. The crime scenes became cleaner. The bodies were disposed of more efficiently. Every detail that could have left a clue was carefully erased. He adjusted his methods, changed locations, and varied his approach. He never struck the same way twice. Each victim, each disappearance, was another move on the chessboard. And he never lost. Buried in the pages of his journal, his true thoughts lay hidden. Page after page of carefully handwritten entries, detailing his emotions, or rather, his lack of them. He documented everything, not just what he did but how it made him feel. Some pages contained nothing more than short, chilling sentences, as if they were whispers from the darkest part of his mind. They never see me coming. They never scream. The fear in their eyes is better than any lesson I've ever taught. To the world he was just another teacher. To his students he was the one who believed in them, who pushed them to succeed. But in the silence of his apartment, beneath the glow of his desk lamp, surrounded by his notes and his thoughts, John Smith was something else entirely. A predator. A hunter. A man who had built a perfect mask, and who wore it so well that no one had ever thought to look beneath it. He had them all fooled. And that was exactly how he wanted it. 4 years, John Smith operated in the shadows, a ghost moving undetected, leaving behind no evidence, no witnesses, and no trails to follow. He had perfected his craft, fine-tuned every detail, and ensured that each crime was nothing more than another unsolved mystery for the police to puzzle over. But in the end, it wasn't sophisticated forensics or an elaborate sting operation that brought him down. It was a mistake. A small, seemingly insignificant misstep, one that unraveled everything. It started with a choice he should have never made. A victim too close to home. A face too familiar. Lisa Harrington had been one of his students just a year before, a bright young woman with a love for literature and a dream of becoming a journalist. She had always been curious, always asking questions, always looking a little too closely at the world around her. Maybe that was what drew him to her. Maybe that was what sealed her fate. But what John Smith didn't anticipate was that this time, the disappearance wouldn't go unnoticed. This time, people remembered the last place she had been. This time, the police paid attention. The night Lisa vanished, she had told friends she was heading home after a late study session at the local library. But she never made it. Her car remained parked in the same spot, her phone left inside. No sign of struggle. No forced entry. Just gone. But this time, there was something John Smith hadn't accounted for: surveillance cameras. A grainy clip from a nearby convenience store showed a car lingering in the area at the time of her disappearance. The vehicle matched the make and model of John Smith's. It wasn't damning evidence, not yet, but it was enough to catch the attention of investigators. Enough to put his name on their radar for the very first time. For weeks, detectives worked quietly, digging deeper, retracing his steps, watching him without his knowledge. They combed through his records, his habits, and his life outside the classroom. And then they found it. A routine traffic stop from years earlier had recorded his license plate, proof that he owned the same car seen the night Lisa went missing. It was still circumstantial, still not enough to make an arrest. But then came the real break. A forensic sweep of vehicles matching the description led them to an abandoned lot, where a single drop of blood was found in the trunk of a sedan. A car registered to none other than John Smith. The blood was old, almost unnoticeable, but science didn't lie. DNA analysis confirmed the match: Lisa Harrington. That was all the police needed. Suddenly the ghost had a name. Suddenly, the man who had walked into his classroom every morning, greeting students with a warm smile, was no longer untouchable. The hunt was over. The evidence was real. And it all led straight to one place: the school's parking lot. The very place he had always believed was his safe zone, the place he had returned to after every calculated kill. The place where, for years, no one had thought to look. It happened so suddenly, so unexpectedly, that for a moment, no one in the classroom truly understood what was going on. John Smith had just finished a lecture on World War II, his voice steady and confident, the same way it had been every day for years. Students had their notebooks open, scribbling down notes, waiting for the next slide to appear on the projector. Then the door opened. Several uniformed officers stepped inside, their expressions grim, their presence commanding. The room fell into stunned silence. Confused glances were exchanged, a nervous chuckle from the back of the class. And then came the words that would forever alter the way they saw their beloved teacher. "John Smith, you are under arrest." The handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists, the cold metal locking tight. He didn't fight. He didn't resist. He simply stood there as if he had been expecting this moment all along. His students, young, innocent, oblivious to the horrors that had been unfolding just beneath their noses, watched in shock as their teacher, the man they trusted, the man they admired, was led out of the room. Some whispered in disbelief. Others sat frozen, unable to process the reality before them. By the time the classroom door swung shut behind him, John Smith was no longer just a teacher. He was a suspect, a murderer, a monster in plain sight. The news spread like wildfire. Local stations aired footage of his arrest within the hour, the headline plastered across every screen: "High school teacher arrested for serial murders." Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, desperate for any new detail. The public, the same people who had once trusted him with their children's education, now demanded justice. His face was everywhere, on newspapers, televisions, internet forums. And as more details emerged, the horror only deepened. During the trial, John Smith sat in the defendant's chair, cold, emotionless, his eyes unreadable. He showed no remorse, no sign of regret. Prosecutors laid out the damning evidence, meticulously detailed notes found on his laptop, outlining the murders step by step. Dates, locations, victim descriptions. His methods, his patterns. It was all there, written in his own words, a blueprint of evil. The defense tried to argue that it was all a misunderstanding, that the notes were nothing more than fiction, the musings of a man with a dark imagination. But the jury wasn't fooled. The evidence was overwhelming, the truth undeniable. The trial lasted weeks, but the jury needed only 2 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty. On all counts. The sentence was swift and final: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The once respected educator, the man who had stood at the front of a classroom teaching history, would now spend the rest of his days in a prison cell, his own name etched into history for all the wrong reasons. And as the judge read out his fate, John Smith simply sat there, his expression unchanged, as if he had already known all along how this story would end. The trial ended. The sentence was passed. John Smith would never walk free again. But even as the courtroom emptied, even as reporters packed away their cameras and the world slowly moved on, something still lingered, an unease that refused to fade. Because the story of John Smith doesn't end here. It can't. Too many questions remain, too many missing pieces that may never be found. The police closed the case, but some believe it was never truly solved. Was John Smith really working alone? Or was there someone else, another shadow in the night, another pair of hands just as stained with blood? The evidence pointed to Smith, but what about the victims who fit the pattern yet were never officially linked to him? Cases that remained unsolved, young women who disappeared under eerily similar circumstances but whose names were never mentioned at trial? Some detectives whispered their doubts, unwilling to say it aloud, but the possibility was there. The true number of victims might be much higher than anyone was willing to admit. And if that's true, where are the bodies? Then there's the other theory, the one that haunts even the most seasoned investigators. What if John Smith didn't act alone? What if someone was out there, still watching, still waiting? A partner? A copycat? An apprentice who learned from the best and is now continuing his work in silence? The idea is chilling, but the details are even worse. Unanswered calls to missing girls' families. A single footprint at a crime scene that didn't match Smith's. And a letter sent to a reporter months after his arrest, containing only 5 words: "You caught the wrong man." It's been years since his arrest, but his classroom still exists. His chair still sits in the same place, untouched, a relic of a past that refuses to stay buried. Some say the room feels colder now, as if the walls themselves remember what happened. Others claim the eerie silence at night is almost unnatural. But if you ever find yourself in that high school in Texas, walking past the very room where John Smith once stood, you might stop. You might glance inside. And for just a second you might wonder, who's the teacher sitting there now? If this story sends shivers down your spine, if the thought of a killer hiding in plain sight makes your skin crawl, then hit the like button. Subscribe for more disturbing true crime stories, because the truth is always darker than fiction.